Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I can't think of a more important topic in the cannabis world than how the media is working to cover it. We have some of the top people here in the business, and I'd like each one to introduce yourself as you go down the line, and we'll get into some hopefully interesting Q&A later on.
Hi, I'm Dan Adams. I'm the cannabis reporter at the Boston Globe. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kristin Jordan. I'm an attorney in New York, and I'm the producer of the Cannabis Media Summit.
I'm Brit Smith. I'm the host of iHeart Blunt Talk, which is a podcast by iHeart Media.
And I'm Jimmy Young. I'm the president and founder and host of In the Weeds, a podcast that's distributed on the Cannabis MultiMedia network.
So this weekend, there's a lot going on in cannabis that the media industry is covering. Here in Massachusetts, you have the opening of the dispensary in Brookline. Monday in New Jersey, the state Senate and Assembly will be voting on a bill that hopefully will be passed along to Governor Murphy and then signed into law. And part of the whole way we look at this is through the eyes of these, there are gatekeepers to you, the readers. So I think there are a lot of topics that are going around today. And we kind of talked about this preliminary before we started, but let's just talk about today's news here and how the Globe played on the opening in Brookline, because the coverage was kind of interesting, I thought. And what's the direction on that? Is it just another story, or is this a trend, or how do you see this playing out for you guys?
I mean, cannabis is something that we are committed to. Can you guys hear me if I lean back a little bit? Or just one over? I mean, we're committed to covering cannabis over the long term. It's not a flash in the pan story for us. And what we're trying to do is bring all the tools of professional journalism to bear on this industry, just as we would any other, but also while recognizing what makes it unique from other industries. And so, people often ask, are you guys trying to sort of help whittle away the stigma around this drug? Well, no. We're not activists, and we're not actively trying to change the narrative, but we are trying to speak about it in just a factual, straightforward way, and in a knowing way, where we try to balance, I would like people who consume cannabis, people who work in the industry, people like you to be able to read our coverage without rolling your eyes, but I also would like the general public to understand it, and so that's sort of a balance we're trying to strike.
Thanks. Kristin, introduce yourself.
Again, I'm Kristin Jordan. I'm an attorney in Manhattan. I've been in the cannabis space for about 5 years, initially with the intention of doing applications for licensing. I used to service the hospitality industry doing liquor license applications, and so I thought that would be a natural way for me to service the industry. Being in New York, we do not yet have legalization. We're hoping that in the next couple of weeks we'll see that. But for me as a profession, I really wanted to make sure I stayed relevant and educated in the space. So I ended up hosting a couple of different groups at my law firm office for the last couple of years. I also helped co-found an organization called the Cannabis Cultural Association, the mission for which was to bring tools and resources to marginalized communities to participate in the legal industry. And then I also put together small conferences with the intention of really creating a cohort to attend those conferences, as opposed to the large-scale conferences where you're really just coming to see an expo or get some general information. And at one of my conferences in May, the Cannabis Law Summit, I had the privilege of having Dan act as one of my speakers, and at one point I saw a bunch of reporters sitting in the corner talking about media and cannabis. And so at that event, we ended up formulating the concept for the Cannabis Media Summit. So unlike my colleagues on the panel, I am not traditional media. I'm learning, but I'm creating space for these conversations.
But one of the things you do is this May's newsletter, which it's not journalism in the traditional sense, but as we're looking to constantly educate people about cannabis and how we as a community act, you provide such a service, because it's really more than just a calendar listing. It's kind of editorializing on which groups are worth your time going to. Because as the industry grows, there's a proliferation. Every night of the week we can go to a different event. There's conventions like this every weekend somewhere in the country. We need guidance because our time is worthwhile. Make sure you get the best value. And that's the kind of service that you do provide.
Yes, Stu's such a great spokesperson for me. I forget sometimes all the different hats I wear. A lot of the things that I do really came from just a need that I saw for myself in trying to navigate the industry. So I created the May's Calendar, which is a weekly newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday morning at 6:30. I started in New York because that's where I'm from and that was my community. And my intention is to list all of the advocacy, industry, and community events. You know, a lot of the big MJBA shows have huge mailing lists, but I was seeing that a lot of the advocacy events weren't getting as many attendees and weren't getting as much attention. So we really try to focus on hyper-local events. And then we've just brought Boston on board, I think, in October. So we service 10 different cities right now.
Brit, I have a question for you. iHeart, major corporation, giving you a platform. How did that come about, and what do you talk about on your podcast?
This really didn't come about because I was interested in it. It came about because the newsroom that I worked in had a lack of expertise on cannabis and a lot of reporters trying to figure it out. And I graduated from UC Berkeley in 2017 and moved to Boston. And I just got a job as a writer for WBZ News Radio. And so I was just writing the scripts for the news anchors to read. And one of the reporters, Carl Stevens, who's an incredible reporter in town, kind of took... Really? Thank you. He kind of took a shine to me, and we got into discussions about some of the stories he was doing were around cannabis and how people were calling into ERs and saying, like, my kid has eaten my cookie, what do I do? And this was the kind of a story he wanted to follow. And we just got into conversation, and he pushed and pushed and pushed until I got given a podcast, because he said, this is an area that Brit is obviously interested in. It's something that nobody else at the station is talking about, that everybody wants to know more about in Massachusetts. And since I come from California, where it's kind of already going on, I had a fair idea of how it might play out here in Massachusetts, and it was a real interest to me. So I originally started the podcast just as a way to have conversations with people who are prominent in the Massachusetts cannabis industry, trying to figure my way around it almost. So I talked to the Cannabis Control Commission, and I spoke to some activists in the area and some other reporters. And now it's kind of gone onto a platform where I'm really just looking to hear people's stories, because this is a big piece of cannabis journalism that's missing, is giving people a platform to tell us how this is impacting them personally, and how cannabis legalization is not playing out fairly at the moment, and there's a lot of activists who have a lot to say, so I try to make sure that my platform gives them space to speak.
Absolutely. Now, Jimmy, you come from a different background, and I'm sure most people, if they're Massachusetts natives, know who you are.
I know.
But your podcast, you're covering a different range of topics. So tell us what you go about. We'll make sure our heart go pitter-patter.
I appreciate it, Stuart. First of all, I'm going to give Dan a little bit of a pat on the back. Well, I grew up in Boston. I'm a longtime veteran of the Boston sports industry. Ernie Roberts was the Saturday morning columnist of choice to read at the Boston Globe. It was must read. This Week in Weed is just like Saturday morning. Ernie Roberts, I think you do a great job. And just please, I know people respect that too. And by the way, as you know, the media gets attacked a lot. You do a great job of that too, handling that. So anyway, I grew up in Boston. I worked in Portland, Maine for 11 years on the CBS affiliate. I actually produced sports at Channel 4 in Boston when I was 20 years old at Tufts University. I've been very fortunate in my life to have had success both on camera and in the production world and in the sales world. But I've really focused now on cannabis. It was a year ago that I had, by the way, never been to a Freedom Rally, never been to NECANN before the last year. And it was a year ago that the In the Weeds podcast started. Stu Zakim was one of my first guests. And from there, we've kind of just gone crazy. We just launched a pro-cannabis multimedia network, Cannabis Multimedia Network, that is mission statement to tell the stories of the industry through the words of those in the industry. Okay, you're not being heard. There are so many great stories about how cannabis has changed people's lives that aren't being told. We want to tell them, and we look forward to it.
And that's a perfect segue into what we talked about earlier, one of the missions about eradicating the stigma of cannabis. Here we have 4 major media corporations devoting and giving right platforms to help educate the consumer. If you present people with balanced information, they'll make their own decisions. But when we have this kind of support, it brings the conversation to the forefront. And stigma is something that surrounds us all. My background, even though I didn't grow up here, I'm a graduate of Boston University's College of Communications. There's a bridge named after my brother. So, civil rights, Fighting against stigma is part of my DNA as well. I can't think of a better place than having my last chapter than in the cannabis business. Because the challenges as a PR person of changing people's opinion is really important to our success. So I embrace that, and that's really what makes my heart go. But when we have platforms like this, the Globe, what Kristin's doing, iHeart Radio, which is, as we know, one of the bigger radio networks in the country, and then what Jimmy's doing. So we want to talk about topics that are important to you, and one of the things I think is going to help our industry get visibility and importance in how it's told through these people is the role cannabis is going to play in the 2020 election. We know every Democratic candidate so far has a plank that addresses their position on cannabis. Flashback to 2016, we had a candidate who was afraid to speak her mind about it, and that may have made a difference in the long run in getting people out to vote. There's other issues, we know immigration, healthcare, but for all of us in this business, it's really our time when we can see it take a center role on the national stage. And through the media, and when we talk about these topics, we're going to help change that conversation. So, about the 2020 election, what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to be a real draw for people? Is it going to get people off their butts and come out and vote who didn't vote last time? Or even change minds from one side of the aisle to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously this is an issue that is in the mind of the public. This has changed a lot since 2016, right? We're talking about this much more often and in much different ways than we were even 4 years ago. Like you said, very notable that all the Democratic candidates support legalization in one way or another, essentially. I think one thing that's happening that's really interesting is that, you know, we talk, especially in Massachusetts, we talk a lot about equity, right? And that's been a way, that word has made it safe for politicians who once opposed legalization to now come around and say they do support it. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I think that one role that I see, you know, an outlet like the Globe playing is to provide accountability. And so, you know, we can talk about equity, but is that actually happening on the ground? Is it a political talking point? Is it a cover for someone who's changing their mind about something? And so I think it's really important that we look at the track records of people, look at what their actual policy proposals are, and then talk to actual entrepreneurs. You know, if what you're talking about is equity and licensing, like let's talk to those people trying to get licenses and see what kind of progress they're making. So this is the kind of thing where my instinct when presented with high-minded rhetoric is to try to just like take it down to the street level, take it down to the level of the entrepreneur, and look at it through that lens. Because I think a huge thing that's important about journalism is sort of giving voice to the voiceless and people who don't, who have not traditionally had access to large media platforms. Not that we're trying to advance their views, but we are saying that they're a part of the conversation. And so when I hear all this talk sort of at the political sphere, at the national level, that doesn't get my juices flowing. But I do like to take those ideas and then just test how they're playing out in real life.
So I don't really have an opinion about the presidential election, but I'll give you an example that's near and dear to my heart in New York. So I'm part of a coalition of social justice activists who have been working in the space for a number of years, led primarily by the Drug Policy Alliance New York chapter. And last year, when we re-elected Governor Cuomo, it was very interesting because earlier in the year he was talking about marijuana still being a gateway drug. And then by mid-year, when Cynthia Nixon started her campaign and started speaking about reparations and social justice and business ownership by marginalized communities, not just jobs, not just bud tending jobs, but business ownership, real participation. That's when the governor started changing his tune. And I don't want to take credit for myself, but there were a large coalition of middle-aged women like myself who were actively working in this industry and supporting Cynthia. And the timing was really unique in that we did a fundraiser for her, for the cannabis community, and got a lot of nice press around that. And then all of a sudden, the governor started issuing reports and requesting the Department of Health to study legalization a little bit closer. And the language around gateway drug was no longer his rhetoric. So I think media plays a huge role. Social justice community and community leaders, and so the platform is really vital.
2020 elections, wow. I think that there's a lot of people that seem to be kind of jumping on board with the cannabis bandwagon as the public opinion shifts a little further towards approval. I think that what you see from politicians is often a reflection of whatever you're telling the politicians that you approve of. So if the stigma goes down in society, you're going to start seeing people approve more and give polls that say that they're for recreational legalization, and then you're going to see that reflected in what the politicians are telling you, oh yeah, we're behind that too. And then I think that their plan is to kind of hope that whoever the masses are that are for legalization gather behind them. I think that it's incredibly important that while we're listening to every single candidate say that they're for it, we really look at what they're talking about, as Dan said, in the sphere of social justice reform. Because if a candidate is not talking about how to right the wrongs of the war on drugs, then I don't particularly want to hear that they want to legalize cannabis. I don't think it's the right time unless we're talking about how to take care of the people that were most impacted by it. So yes, they might have it as their platform and they might be running on it in 2020, but I think when it starts to whittle down, we'll start to hear kind of the details of what they really think should happen, and that's when we're going to start seeing real movement towards legalization.
I hate politicians, I just want to say, I'm sorry. They lie, they resign from presidencies. This is my life, and all my favorite politicians got shot in the 60s. Okay, that's my experience. That being said, I certainly am happy now that we are actually talking about this subject coming up to this presidential election. I think it's great that the Democratic Party has embraced it as an issue, and the future is bright. I have no idea, none of us really know how quickly we're going to move off the descheduling of this, of cannabis at the federal level, but it is going to happen in the year 2019. You can remember me saying this, I really do believe that, and by the way, those weren't really my words. I got to interview Barney Frank yesterday. Okay? And trust me, he's a better source than I am, okay? I just want to say. So, no, I have opinions, as you guys know, but I try to avoid this whole game because I can't take anybody's word for gospel anymore in the political arena. They follow the flow, guys. Granted, we're in the middle of a green wave. Democracy is ruling. Capitalism is thriving in this. But really, we don't really know what's going to happen next. And it's fascinating to me just to be part of it.
I think actually one really interesting thing that I've noticed is that, you know, for many of you in this room, maybe cannabis is like a deeply motivating issue to you, where you wouldn't even consider voting for someone if they wanted to go on board with how you felt about it. That's fine. I think there's a lot of other people, though, it's not so much that cannabis is the central issue for them, it's actually a signifier of a candidate's other views. In other words, if someone is the kind of politician who does support, you know, social racial justice in a legalized marijuana industry, then there may also be the kind of person who supports, you know, issues X, Y, Z, all the other things that you care about. They sort of tend to get bundled as a package. So I think you see politicians using their stance on marijuana to signify, you know, their broader policy platform. It gives you an idea of what the sort of rest of the person is like. So I think that's just an interesting thing.
No, I agree with you 100%. Thank God it's coming to the forefront of the conversation. But as much as politics plays into the storytelling, so does the medical side, and how cannabis has changed people's lives. And in my opinion, the best way to change the negative stereotype are to tell these stories, which we do, but the more we tell them, the more it really reinforces it. And I know there are some people in the room who have a really positive story how cannabis changed their life. Getting that word out definitely can melt people's hearts, whether it's about children or adults. I don't know if you saw the documentary last year that Ricky Lake did called Weed the People. Those are the kind of messages that I would love to see out there. Not talk about the business and the amount of revenue it's generating and the tax anticipation, but how, when it's legally controlled, we can really benefit people's lives. So does those stories do anything for you guys? I mean, obviously you have a different kind of beat and focus, but do you see a role that will play as well?
No, you go, Dan.
There's a fine line there. I think the conversation is kind of moving beyond that. I think a lot of us have seen and heard those stories of like patients who have benefited from it, and I certainly don't mean to invalidate those people's stories. They're legitimate. I've listened to them. I take them seriously. We've told those kinds of stories. I'm sure that we'll continue to. It feels a little bit like a story that maybe like once you've heard it once, you've heard it. And I think that there tends to be a lot of cookie cutter media stories like that because the narrative is so familiar. It's really easy. Like you just kind of find a person and then like drop them into that box and like bam, you have a story. So that's the kind of thing where I'd be trying to dig a little deeper. You know, if we're talking about medical patients, it's not hard to find someone with an interesting individual story, but I'm kind of more interested in maybe how a policy would affect like all the card-holding patients in Massachusetts, right? If they could like change the rules so they can go straight from the doctor's office to the dispensary, like what would that mean for people? Then I would want to talk to someone about how that would change their life. But I'm always going to be trying to connect it to a current news event, you know, something like that the Cannabis Commission is debating. So that's just sort of how I look at that stuff. And again, I just want to be clear, I'm really not crapping on people who tell those stories. I'm not saying anything negative about the subjects of those stories. I just think at a certain point, like we get it, right?
Now I get to go. Go ahead. Okay. So I've been railing about the lack of a public service announcement that's pro-cannabis being played in the traditional media. Not every single story. By the way, I know the difference between someone who writes the story and someone who writes the headlines. Okay? The headlines are there to sensationalize and grab your attention. Okay? Commercial media is driven by how many eyeballs, how many times. They're there to sell papers. We're there to create audience on radio. Where are the good stories? Where is the call to the public to inform the public about the benefits of this drug? Everything you are hearing in traditional media. They're not taking commercials, folks. It's ridiculous to me that they're not. Until we get to that point, we will never get to a new normal. We have to push your local people to do these stories. And I know, Dan, look, you do a great job, and I love how you advance the story, but the basic stories. Hey, I've got this system in me. I take a little of this drug, and I feel even better. I mean, basic stories. And you don't assume that just because this audience is pro-cannabis and they know what the benefits are, the public still, we're fighting it every day when we meet with someone or talk with someone who's like, oh, you're in the cannabis business? Whoa. Right? So I've been railing on this, and I will continue, and I'll tell you another thing that I push for, and Dan, I think you'll like this. There's so much big money coming into Massachusetts now. You know, they're already taking up some of the local dispensaries, and it's a big cash grab at the highest level. I really believe in social responsible capitalism. I really believe that these companies need the pressure of the people like you to get them to do social equity programs. How about underwriting a public service announcement? I cannot believe that we still can't put that on the air. It's crazy to me. My phone. Sorry, that's how I did it. I like it.
I disagree. I think medical is, for me anyway, is my focus. It's my most interesting subject that I follow in cannabis. I follow how cannabis is affecting the financial world, how cannabis is affecting the social world, and I think that the medical world has the most potential for stories. It's not necessarily, for me, about telling personal individual stories. It's about talking to scientists and medical experts who can explain to me how the endocannabinoid system works. Why does cannabis work for pain and it also works for insomnia? How does it maybe kill cancer? Like, I want to talk to doctors and medical experts who are researching this stuff, and it's not necessarily in the US. A lot of research is going on abroad, and one of the associations in cannabis, C3RN here in Boston, connects all these people who have scientific research around the world about cannabis. And so I think it's an incredibly interesting story. I talked to Dr. Marion McNabb a few weeks ago from C3RN, and she has new stuff to tell me every single time I talk to her about the advancement of cannabis science. So I do think this is an interesting sphere for a lot of people, and I think that it could really have an impact on the way that healthcare changes in the future.
I think for me, I come at this from a little different perspective because I'm not traditional media. And for me, given my experience and my education in cannabis, I really see all cannabis use as being medical or wellness. I don't see a distinction there. I think where we see the distinctions are the state programs. And in New York specifically, there are a number of reasons why people would not avail themselves of a medical card and be part of that program. Number one, I'm from upstate New York, from Syracuse, and there are a lot of folks who hunt. And you cannot possess a gun, a firearm, and be a medical patient. So I think there are a lot of reasons why people would avoid a medical program. And it's cost prohibitive in New York. There's a number of reasons. We don't have flour available to us. A number of reasons why folks would steer clear of the medical program in New York. So the distinction between medical and recreational or adult use, I think is a little bit nerve-wracking for me, because I think it also gives political cover for certain policies, right? So in New York right now, as an activist, we're fighting for home grow for everybody. Right now, it's only permissible in the current budget bill for medical card holders, thank you, patients. And it's 4 plants, a total of 8 per household. And so drawing those distinctions, I think, is problematic for the industry.
Well, this is a really valid point, and I'm glad everyone had a different point of view on it.
So for those of us in the room who do have a story, how do we reach all of you so we can share that?
That's a great question. My inbox is about to hit like the 15,000 unread email mark. And if you saw our story on Thursday, the Spotlight series we've been working on, you know I've been pretty busy. It's hard to reach me sometimes. So honestly, just like come at me by email, send me a DM on Twitter, nag me a little bit. Sometimes you kind of have to push to get through it. I never mean to ignore anybody, but to be totally honest, if I answered every email I got, and I mean like not spam, I mean like real emails from real people, even if I did that, if I responded to all of them, I would never write a story. And I hate that. I really wish I could respond to everyone, but in the last year, the volume has just gotten so intense. At a certain point, I have to do my job. I love you guys, though. So just keep sending me emails and nagging me, like texting me, whatever. I try to be as accessible as I can, but just understand that we're trying to balance that.
And of course, Heather, we want to tell your story, so just call me.
Yeah, no, but look, we do really want good stories. I don't mean any of that to be a discouragement, but please, just be a little persistent and don't take it personally. That's what it is.
Before we ask another question, what do you guys think are the top stories that we're looking at in 2019? And maybe that can generate some more specific questions.
I think it's social equity, I really do. I think it's the way that the policies start to change from here on out and who gets heard. And I think it's about which people get to participate in this industry as it grows, who gets access to it, and making sure that there are people from communities of color who were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs who also get their foot in the door here.
What she said.
I'll tell you though, I think the number one issue is, look, I love social equity, I'm all for that, by all means. I want programs, I don't want lip service. I don't. I'm tired of hearing about everybody's, oh, we're going to do this. I haven't heard of a program that's viable yet, although I did meet you, Kristin, and I think you're on your way. The number one issue for me in 2019 is going to be the descheduling. That's what's going to happen. The banks are going to get involved. Money talks in this country, folks. I think that's a fact. You don't have to check that, right? Right? So that my feeling is it's going to be the descheduling of cannabis.
In my opinion, it's New York legalization. I really feel like that's going to be a huge page turner for us, not only because of the way that New Yorkers live, the composition of the state, the demographics of the state. I just think that our economy touches so many other national and international economies as well.
Is anyone covering it well in New York? I feel like there's such a dearth of coverage down there.
It's been interesting. So I've been contacted by some local business papers. Cranes is looking into it, City and State, which is a political media company. So I'm seeing it happen very slowly, but on the political spectrum. I'm also seeing a lot of business-oriented finance and real estate are also now really.
It's just kind of amazing that the Times is like nowhere on the move.
No, and I would say
New York Times, you can quote me on this if you're listening.
I think it's amazing how no bigger papers across the U.S. have cannabis reporting teams like the Boston Globe does. Like I keep pushing for iHeart Media to give me more help. There's so much to talk about, and there's massive newspapers that have nobody on this.
New Jersey, the Star Ledger has a very vibrant newsletter.
Advanced
Media, and New Jersey Cannabis Insider, Justin's here. But he's done a really good job in the year as the movement moves towards Monday. They've been really on top of the coverage and providing really good information.
We were joking last year, I think the New York Times came out with an article about vaping. They just discovered it last year.
People are vaping, and the Times is on.
Now you're in the news
TV, right? The news
Yeah, thanks for a great panel. Do you think that you're talking a lot about the sort of positive role the media plays, giving voice to people, educating people, even if it's not, there's no political agenda behind it, as Dan said, but inevitably tends to support a legalization movement just because it gets the stories out there. But it seems like at the same time there's kind of a counterattack going on in the media, not just by the traditional prohibition crowd, but by some prominent intellectuals. There was that article by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker, the Alex Berenson book, and I'm just wondering, what do you think of that? Are these guys just trying to be gadflies and get attention by just taking out a different position, or do you think this is part of a broader trend that we're now going to see of intellectuals, sort of it's going to become chic among certain intellectuals to come out on the opposite side of the issue?
I don't think that we should. I don't think we should dismiss criticism of marijuana or legalization out of hand. I think we should look seriously at the facts. And some of the people you mentioned are not stupid people. But just to take one for instance, the book that came out by Alex Berenson that got a lot of attention on this subject. I haven't looked at it and done fact checking and reporting on it, but I've seen a lot written calling into question some of the assertions that it makes, including by some of the researchers that he cited who said, excuse me, that's actually not what my study said, at all. And that probably would have been like a good phone call to make before you wrote the book.
Who cares about that?
So I just care. I don't want to get into a debate with Malcolm Gladwell about legalization. It's not my job, but I do think that we should apply rigor and skepticism to those arguments. But we shouldn't be closed-minded. We should listen to them. It's this is a substance that's going to be regulated. It does have an effect on the mind and body, and I'm very open to hearing research. I went to a sort of a public health-oriented conference in Los Angeles in January, and I think we should all be very careful not to caricature public health people as sort of like old-timey, reefer madness prohibitionists. Most of them are not. They're just sincere researchers, and they're looking at the numbers in front of them. I think what's happened is because of the way that federal research gets funded, is that it tends to look for negative effects. It goes out seeking those, and they may be there. I'm not saying they're not. I do think we need a more balanced research picture. But I would just caution people against being too hard-line. I think we should listen to those people, but I also think that if someone publishes a book and they're citing studies and saying this is what they mean, and then the people who did those studies say, no, it's not, I'm going to listen to the person who wrote the study.
Right. Science and research leads the debate. Use facts for your arguments. We're all in debates, right? We all are out there talking about this. There's an amazing amount of information about the scientific and positive effects of this plant.
Hi there. I'll give you a really quick setup. My cousin is about half my age. She's brilliant, tall, beautiful. She is getting ahead faster. They just finished a production in her production company called Wadiatrics, where they interviewed the medical, basically the father of medical marijuana industry in Israel. Yes, they just finished doing that. My wife is brilliant. She graduated from a school with an H in Cambridge. She has a master's degree over there. I won't say the school, everybody knows it. But my question is, how does someone like her, who doesn't have the outgoingness of me and my cousin, break into your industry? Because she knows 2 weeks in advance things before they hit the paper. She always tells me all this information, and she's brilliant and should be working with one of you folks. How does somebody get into your industry, into your side of things? Good start now. Okay, because I'm her biggest advocate.
So there's a lot of space for a lot of different people to tell different stories in different ways in cannabis journalism. There could be a podcast by a cannabis lawyer. There could be a newspaper by an investigative reporter who's looking into social equity stuff. Like, there's a lot of different factions of the cannabis area to look at. And it really depends on the way that she best presents the information that she learns about. So she might be a writer, she might be a speaker, whichever medium she can best put across. See, I think I'm a writer as well, but I got given a podcast. So you just have to kind of try out the different methods, and sometimes discussion works best, sometimes you formulate your thoughts better through writing. But my advice to her would be to figure out how you best research, how you best produce your work, and then find a company who's looking for somebody who's specializing in cannabis. There's a lot of internships out there. There's a lot of newspapers and magazines that are looking for people to do online writing for them. That's how I got into it. I got an internship in an online magazine. And I just researched and wrote about cannabis over and over and over again. And then I took that as kind of evidence to my next writing job that, hey, I know I'm a writer of news, but I could write cannabis too. So whatever job she gets into, she can bring the cannabis into that space.
By the way, O'Neill and Associates, the big PR company in town, run by Thomas O'Neill, they're helping out the cannabis industry, let's just say. So that's a great contact for her to reach out to, and I'm happy to make that intro, because I'm sitting down with Thomas O'Neill on Tuesday to talk about this.
Thank you. Hi.
I'm from Vermont, and we're hopefully going to see legalization sometime soon. What I've noticed, and it's on track with someone over there I talked about, the media, WCAX Channel 3, they've started ramping up, like they do things now. They released a headline that was, man crashes car and kills someone, they discovered THC in the system. The bottom of the article, the last line, mentions that he also had opiates and alcohol. Bottom of it. Is there any media out there that's like actively their job is like, you can send them articles like that and they're putting them on blast?
Write emails to the paper, right? I mean, get that word out there.
That's like, I mean, when they're posting.
I mean, there's various like fact-checking sites out there that I'm sure you can find and send it to. But yeah, I actually agree. I mean, if the story's problematic, it's, contact the reporter and respectfully explain why it's problematic. Just try to. I know it's frustrating for people who are experts to read what you consider to be ignorant coverage. Just try to appreciate that a lot of people, news is a tough business, right? Like, the Globe newsroom is a fraction the size it was in the year 2000, and most outlets do not have, people like me and my colleague Naomi Martin here who are dedicated to this full time. They're generalists, they're general assignment reporters who are parachuting into a quick hit news story, and an hour later they're going to be writing about something else, and they just don't know. So give them a chance, like write them an email and just say, here's how I wish you would have discussed this. I think you missed some really important context to help us understand this. And another thing that I've been working on is getting together a sort of society of professional cannabis journalists. And I think that I think one of the things that I'd like to do under the auspices of that is to create like, a glossary, a style guide, resources for reporters who don't have the time themselves to become expert. Because for me, it took a year of being really immersed in this before I think I became sort of fluent in it. And to try to let others access that expertise. I mean, I don't, some outlet in Vermont is not my competition. I'd be happy to help them write a better, more accurate story about cannabis. So I'll try to assemble some of those resources and make them available.
It's just really discouraging to see things like that, especially with headlines and what gets articles shared.
And again, the headline is not their responsibility, okay? And let's just get rid of pot shops once and for all, guys. I'm sick of it, right?
But you also have options, as Dan mentioned, reaching out to the reporter, but also social media. If a story is reported correctly in your mind, you can take your take on it and post it out there and try and change the conversation that way. Because the paper's biased, you don't know what kind of direction they're being given. But as a consumer, you want to write stories, but you want to take it upon yourself. Everyone's a journalist today. The beauty is social.
That's right.
Mike, right over there.
Hi, I'm Chandra Batra. I was one of the founding patrons for Mass Patients, and unfortunately one of the things that the state still doesn't have is compassion or pediatrics or caregivers. We've been stepped on as a poor people. The doctors here charge $250 a recommendation, and we've never ever had a chance to have a true patient voice or a true say-so in the state. And as a poor person, I eat at free meals. I get random presents from random people. Love the randoms, love our random angels in this industry because they're random and they love you. But unfortunately, as someone with fibromyalgia who has to go stand in a free food line, I see people who are doing a hell of a lot worse than I am right now. As a patient who's been lifelong since I was 19, there are people in walkers and wheelchairs who are my friends who eat at free meals just with me, who don't want to do cannabis and don't want to take the risk of upsetting the powers that be. Seeing that I've never given a F about the powers that be, Mickey Martin and my daddy were my daddy. I don't really care about anything that anyone has to say. I just think it's really funny that people think I do. But I just want to know, how do you take a social media following like the one I semi-got, which is a rather scattered bunch of people, and turn it into an actual writing career? Before my health got worse, I wanted to go to the new media school in New York and actually get my journalism MFA. But how do you go about that nowadays?
think we answered that question actually when you asked about internships.
yeah,
Same advice.
The way I got into it was applying for a writing job and then telling the new employees of at my writing job that I was also a specialist in cannabis and that I could help them by focusing my writing on cannabis and that I could bring something to the company by giving them that expertise and that interest. So I think what companies are looking for is for you to tell them what you can bring to them, because they might not be interested in cannabis or learning about the writing that you're doing about cannabis, but if you explain to them why this is important, the kind of research that you've done behind it, and the kind of the voice you can bring to it, they might be more interested in that subject.
And I don't want to waste our panelists' time about job inquiries. Let's talk about the topic of cannabis and what they do. So if we can have questions geared to that, I think we'll be more effective in the 6 minutes we have left. So I don't know who's got the mic.
Yeah, hi. When you were saying we should develop an association, I think you were talking about reporters in general from, I don't know, outlets, like official outlets. I don't know if you meant freelancers also, but to me it was sort of a it was a little bit of a red flag, but not, for me, I've lived in Boston 13 years, and I noticed the city is very exclusive, like all these different industries, everybody needs a degree and this and that. And so I would hope that people who have any experience could still, you know, with cred, obviously with bylines, enter such an association. So that's
No, absolutely. And I'm sorry if anything I said gave the impression that my vision for this was for it to be some sort of exclusive club of like top tier cannabis people behind closed doors or something. No, anyone who has experience writing about it professionally, I would like welcome their input, their expertise, like how have readers reacted to this? What do you think the best way, Jimmy was mentioning, should we use the phrase pot shops? Like those are the kind of discussions we want to have, and I think it's vital that we hear a lot of voices in those discussions. It's not for some elite to make those decisions behind closed doors. And again, my idea for it is just to provide free resources, education to people like to general assignment reporters who don't have the time to develop that expertise. In terms of the people who do have it now, I have a very open mind about who that is, and I know not to be a card-carrying member of some large outlets.
When I produced the Cannabis Media Summit in December, I thought it was really interesting to see the guests, the attendees who purchased tickets. We kept it an affordable ticket, so it was a $99 ticket, and we really wanted to encourage people from all over the country to come in. And we had folks from Iowa, middle of the country, Mississippi, who were doing podcasts or just writing blogs, and really wanted to access resources like Dan and other folks who are more mainstream. But there are folks out there doing things in their own communities.
Yeah, I actually went to that. I went to that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for coming.
Someone has the mic back.
Yeah. So I'm Julie Battle, and I certify patients for medical cannabis. And in doing the recertifications more and more in this past year, just from a public health perspective, the thing that I've become concerned about is, and I'm just curious if you guys know about any reporting system, like when a new drug, the FDA passes a new drug, it's reflexively set up a mandatory adverse event reporting system, and those are all collected. Those are some of the things that have been added to the warnings or the black box or whatever. But my concern is, I'm just starting to see things. I'm starting to have questions about some of the cards and some of the we need just, there's no repository, or I'm like, should I call the NIH, the CDC, for just trying to think about, because we're all so reactionary and people are going to have bad, things are going to be faulty, and it's going to be in the media, it's going to be like, blah, blah, kill someone.
That's a great point. I actually think, so in the absence of federal oversight of this industry, right, I think the media actually plays an even more important accountability role. And that's why, an outlet like ours, sometimes people, I think, mistakenly get the impression that we are pro-cannabis industry, and that's not the case at all. I think, we accept legalization as sort of a given here. We're not relitigating that in every story. It's not like every story about a bar or alcohol policy ends with but should alcohol be legal at all? We don't do that. But yeah, absolutely. We're super committed to providing accountability to the industry. I've also heard, concerning things, like I've heard, for example, about the flaws in our lab testing system here. So I don't know if you guys know this, but the licensed producers get to pick the samples that they send to the labs. you don't have to be like an expert in scientific methodology to understand why that would be problematic. So that doesn't make us anti-cannabis, but you know, like we're gonna keep writing those stories. You know, if you're saying there's an issue with like some vape cartridges, I've heard things like that. That's exact. I would bring that kind of stuff to a good media outlet, but you know, there's no reason why I couldn't. You know, we could go buy some of them, send them to a lab ourselves and see what's in. Like, let's write that story. And I think, again, if there's not going to be federal health regulators taking care of that stuff, then it's almost too bad. But sure, like, yeah, absolutely, the media should step up and play that role.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry.
So, who's got the mic? Okay.
There's a lot of good stories coming out now of what's going on in this industry, such as, you know, bad testing, it's rejected, so on and so forth. You know, people dumping, or dispensaries dumping stuff all over the place. And you just had a great article on these licensees that have more than 3 licenses and so on. There's a lot more out there. But what I'd like to see is almost like a separate article every once in a while on follow-up to these investigations and stories that you started with. Because sometimes, like, you know, you hear about a lot, like the dispensary that was, you know, dumping the stuff outside. Well, there was never a fault. Did they get penalized? How much money? Is anybody going after it? And a lot of us in the community want to know what the results are, because we're trying to do it legally, and you see all these people violating and stuff, you know? So.
My colleague Naomi informed me we did write a follow-up to that. So.
Yeah.
Do a visual.
Yeah,
But,
you have to search for them.
Yeah, but like also remind us, man. Like send us an email and be like, hey, whatever happened with X. I have literally written stories in response to readers who just said, hey, whatever happened with such and such, and I said, oh, that's a good point. I pick up the phone, and then like the first person I called was like, yeah, actually, holy crap, there's this huge development. I was like, oh, great.
Yeah, give journalists your feedback, because I think this is really a collaborative effort as we go forward. And cannabis journalism is very new to all of us. We're all still learning as well, so reach out.
You know, we're all learning this game.
All right, thank you to our panelists. Thank you.